So first, I want to say thank you to all of our panelists for being here, and thank you to our attendees. So I want to say hello and welcome to the panel Peace Without Police, a discussion on the definition, history, and current politics surrounding police abolition. Today, we have 4 panelists who represent a diverse set of perspectives on the current state of police abolition, both regionally and nationally. They are accomplished individuals in their respective fields of academia, activism, and advocacy. Blaque and I mainly planned this event because we wanted to educate ourselves as well as provide a learning space for the broader community so we can all begin envisioning peace without police. For our audience, we just want to remind you guys that this is a panel and we want it to be informative as possible. So we'll be primarily focusing on answering questions in the chat. So please feel free to post any questions you may have there. And you can also vote for other people's questions if you really want to see one of them answered.
Awesome. So first off, I'm Malika and Melissa here. And we are both sophomores here at Rice. And we just decided to put this panel together because we met each other in a program at the Center for Civic Leadership, where we learned a lot about the justice system, and that kind of guided our interest to want to learn more about police abolition specifically. So with that, we're going to post our panelists' names and affiliated institutions in the chat, just short blurbs, but we also want our panelists to introduce themselves and just speak a little bit about the connection or general area they have kind of interest in on the topic of abolition or whatever position they may have. Also, while you're introducing yourselves, we want you to kind of think about abolition as we get into the Q&A questions. So we're going to ask y'all to think of 1 or maybe 2 words that you kind of associate with the words police abolition. So kind of like a word association. So yeah, with that, Andrew, do you want to start us off?
I'd be honored. Good evening, everyone. Really thankful for this opportunity. My name is Andrew Hairston. I direct the Education Justice Project at Texas Appleseed, which is a public interest justice center based in Austin. We work across the state of Texas. We have a broad mission to dismantle unjust laws and policies that disproportionately burden historically underserved Texans. But we get to work in various program areas like education justice, criminal justice, and housing, just to name a few. For me, I'm a lawyer by training, and the journey to abolition was probably as tortuous as my journey from kindergarten through the end of law school, which was all consecutive with no breaks. When I got to law school, I was probably thinking that I wanted to be a public defender in Louisiana, modeling after a couple of aunts who are lawyers in Mississippi and Louisiana. But then as I got to the beginning of my second year of law school, Michael Brown was murdered in Ferguson. And it resonated with me because my family and I lived in Florissant, Missouri for a time, which is the adjacent suburb to Ferguson. And I just started thinking about how can I do more impact work, more systemic work. So I ended up going to DC after my second year of law school to intern for an organization called Advancement Projects National Office, which is a racial justice organization. And that really got the wheels turning about the idea of abolition. This was the summer of 2015. I was still like, I don't know if I can say that I'm an abolitionist. I don't know if I, at this point agree that prisons and police need to go. But over the past nearly 6 years, everything has confirmed that, right? From Alton Sterling and Philando Castile after I graduated from law school. That happened while I was studying for the bar exam, to Sandra Bland later on in 2015, all the way up to George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and other victims of state violence. And so, I've arrived at this moment focusing on young people and how the prison industrial complex impacts them through the school to prison pipeline. But, it feels like this is the opportunity to call for abolition, primarily within the scope of police-free schools for young people to operationalize it. And the words I would associate with abolition are transformative justice.
Thank you. Blaque, do you want to go next?
Sure. So hi, I am Blaque Robinson. I'm really honored to be here today, honored to be asked to participate in this panel with these esteemed colleagues in the activism and abolitionist work and just the work of justice and freedom. And so what currently I am a fourth year graduate student in the Department of Sociology at UNC Chapel Hill. I am a proud graduate of Rice University. Shout out to all my Rice University fam. Lady C, I see you here. So shout out to you. You're very formative in my growth. So I always love to shout out my people when I see them. I graduated Rice in 2016, class of 2016. So my work broadly focuses currently in graduate school on understanding the Black experience. So I look at different things such as mental health, physical health of Black folks. I look at inequalities in terms of socioeconomic status. My dissertation work in particular focuses on moving the academy forward and understanding that the Black community is not a monolith. And so I am seeking to actually understand how Black folks make distinction between and amongst themselves in community settings, which has implications for conversations like these around sort of how do we move forward as a Black community. It has implications for sort of how are we talking within the Black community as we've continued to become more diverse socioeconomically, as we continue to sort of bring forth and, you know, folks like myself and the queer community are sort of moving forward and having more of a voice, pushing ourselves really to have more of a voice and say, yes, we're part of the Black community and things like that. So those are the sorts of things that I study. I'm also a teacher because of graduate school, and that is really where sort of my abolitionist work is focused right now. So similar to sort of Andrew, I teach undergraduate students at UNC Chapel Hill, and really the ethos of my entire class is equity and social justice. And so in terms of thinking about my connection to police abolition, really what I do in my class is both myself and my students, we learn about the overall systems of oppression. So race, class, gender, sex, and sexuality are the ones that we focus on that continue to oppress us, right? So I focus on sort of theories. I focus on sort of teaching my students all the theories about how each of these systems has come about and why they continue to persist. And then we look at various social issues across the spectrum that they get to choose from, and their task is to analyze them. And so that's where my abolitionist work is in creating social justice warriors in the classroom and using the project of academia for good by teaching my students. And when I think about abolition, Andrew, I thought the same word as you, transformative justice, but I'll go with my second choice, which is freedom, because I truly believe that when we abolish the police, because the police were always meant to oppress in the first place and protect whiteness as property, the racial hierarchy, all of those things, when we abolish the police, we will truly be a free society that is able to communicate with one another. And I'll probably talk about that a little bit later, my sort of hippy dippy perspective on sort of how we move forward and where change actually comes from. But I believe that abolishing the police leads to freedom and community communication, which is what I think we need more of.
Thank you. And Ashton, would you like to go next?
So my name is Ashton P Woods. I am the founder of Black Lives Matter Houston. I am here by way of New Orleans via Hurricane Katrina. And I do a lot of different things. I don't have one specific lane, but I work on everything from legislation to national change and even international projects. Right now, what we're doing is thinking of, actually, these are my two words, of building and education, because you have to teach people who to be mad at. In other words, if your child is having issues at school, you want to tell them to go to the HISD meeting. We're in Houston. Well, I'm in Houston. And so you don't want them to go to City Hall. So it's about teaching people where to show up and how to show up and what to, not necessarily what to say, but to say, these are my issues. And I need you to take these things into consideration when you're making these policies and passing these laws, because you're not talking to the people who they're going to affect the most. I guess a great example of that was when Kimag tried to get X amount of dollars to add more prosecutors on to her office. Kimag is the district attorney of Harris County here in Houston. And the issue is, why are you adding more prosecutors when you should be doing cite and release, when you should be doing different things to make sure that people are not coming into this cycle of recidivism. These are people who don't have cell phones, don't have the internet. They ride the bus everywhere they go. They ride a bicycle. They don't necessarily have reliable transportation. And much of what we deal with from our prosecutors here and our law enforcement indicates that they don't need the money. The money needs to go to building communities and putting healthcare centers and funding our local schools, not just with Texas tax dollars, but to make sure that people have what they need in order to have their life chances be increased mentally, physically, and emotionally, but just to thrive in society. And I believe that if we actually talk to the people who actually really need the help and not focus on naysayers and not focus on getting permission from politicians and people who are talking heads that don't do anything in community, I think that we would make larger strides, because every day talking to people and helping people who might just need something. And when you're talking about police abolition, you're also talking about mutual aid. You're talking about giving people access to housing where they're not going to be evicted during a pandemic, right? You're holding your justices of the peace accountable, your commissioner's court accountable, your city government accountable, and whatever entities that you might be under, because at the end of the day, they may sign off on something or not sign off on something that could literally change your life. And that has a lot to do with police abolition, in my opinion.
Thank you. And Steve, would you like to go?
Yeah, before I kind of introduce myself, I just want to thank the organizers for inviting me on this panel and thank my other panelists. State my gratitude for being in your company. I think one of the things, and I mentioned this before, we had a short discussion, I just moved to Houston in November. I finished my PhD in urban planning at the University of Illinois. And so I'm pretty new here, so I'm still if I get some acronym wrong or if I get some institutional detail, if I'm a little bit off, I'd just like to have this preemptive apology. But so anyhow, now that I'm past that, I work at the Kinder Institute as a research fellow. The Kinder Institute is a think tank within Rice University that focuses on urban policy issues, and I mostly focus on criminal justice and housing issues. So yeah, I wrote my dissertation about policing, and you may think that's kind of interesting because he said he has a PhD in urban planning. And I came to that, and I came to research policing as a planner, right? Like I really want to identify and research the sort of city building work that police do. And a lot of that interest came directly out of working as a planner. So before I got my PhD, I got my master's, and I worked for a few years for the city planning office of Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is a city with the very infamous and bloody history of racist violence. And it's a city where wounds are raw. I'll just leave it at that. That glosses over a lot of detail, but that's in the interest of time. And a lot of my work was just really standing in front, like Parks and Rec style, standing in front of a crowd of, mince no words here, angry racist white people, kind of on the fringes of Tulsa and the kind of excerpts of the city, wanting to, saying a lot of things about, quote, those people. And it's a really common problem that planners have. And I wanted it kind of helped push me in this direction of wanting to research what the heck policing and really kind of broadly the state's power and state kind of legal power means to planning practice. And my search took me far away from Tulsa, and I got interested in what policing and public safety means for how urban universities react with the neighborhoods around them. So people here who are from, let's say, Southside Chicago, Hyde Park, this issue is very important. If you're from West Philadelphia, this issue is very important. And also, I would say to a different extent, and Rice as well, I wrote my dissertation, though, about none of those places. I wrote it about Atlanta, Georgia, and it was a 2-case project researching Georgia Tech and Georgia State and how those universities have grown in central Atlanta. So those two schools, for those of you who don't know, very large public universities, about 1.5 miles apart in the center of Atlanta, but really two incredibly different places. Tech is a tech-centered school, predominantly white, Georgia State graduates more Black bachelor's degree holders than any other university in the country. Predominantly, it and Wayne State are the only two Research One majority minority institutions in the country, Wayne State being in Detroit. And when I went into those places, and I'll kind of wrap this up here to pivot towards abolition, I want to look at policing more broadly. So people have this image of policing, that it's the municipal police out there in the streets. And yes, it's that, but it's a lot of other police agencies and institutions. And a lot of my work focused on campus policing, which I know will be of particular interest here. But downtown Atlanta alone had, by my count, 13 different police organizations, 11 of which had fully trained officers with guns and arrest power, employed by a different variety of public and also private entities. And on top of that, and this is where my work as a planner comes in, policing is not just what are called constabulary patrols. It's also zoning, which is something we kind of famously don't have here in Houston. It's a lot of things that have to do with what is conceived to be the public well-being. And this is kind of where I run into a wall or run into some challenges with abolition. Because certainly I believe that the constabulary police needs to have its power checked. On the other hand, I believe the EPA is a good thing. And I kind of don't believe that oil refineries should have the ability by right to build facilities next to, I'm gonna drop an F-bomb, next to fucking playgrounds. Which is something I've seen that happens here, particularly in East Houston, if you go to Harrisburg, Manchester. And so a lot of what I think, when I think about what a new, thinking about abolition, I always think it's not just about policing, it is more about the state. Policing is it's like a mushroom, right? It's this visible manifestation, but everything is happening beneath the surface, and that is the state. If policing is rotten, it's because the state is rotten. And very broadly, I think that, and this is the other kind of thing I noticed in my research, police, even constabulary police, but also when we think about zoning, it all centers on some kind of different, very diverse ideas of personal well-being. And I have to tell you something, campus police do a lot of care work for students, and they shield a lot of students in the criminal justice system. There are more drugs at Rice University, I assume, than probably most neighborhoods in Houston. And those students are probably not the campus police, drunk students. Like, well, we're gonna treat them this way because students are not just students; they're also IGUs, income generating units. You're too harsh on the students that suddenly got college, might jeopardize tuition dollars, either through expulsion or students not wanting to go there because, it's not seen as a fun place. You want to study, but you also want to do other things. So I think when I think about the two words, going back to the original question, I just kind of like to circle back on this question of one, state, and two, care. How can you make the state's discretion actually care for its citizens? And with that, I will end the introduction. Thank you again.
Yeah, of course. Thank you to our panelists for introducing yourself and for answering the question. So right now I don't see any questions in the Q&A, so I'll ask one of the questions Blaque and I came up with. So that is, what, if any, purpose do police serve currently in 2021?
Like Blaque said, the same things they did in 1865, protect white people's property and to patrol Black people. Slave patrols in 1865, right, leading up to the Civil War and the Reconstruction era. But those two fundamental purposes have been consistent over the past 150 plus years of policing. And we see that particularly within school contexts, right, of how young people, especially since 1950, since the first school police officers appeared in schools in the US and Michigan, in the subsequent 70 years, how Black and brown children, LGBTQ young people, and kids with disabilities are those who are policed as they are in community. And so the police serve those purposes only, and for those reasons, as we will extrapolate on in this panel, they gotta go.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that. I think I really like Steve's point, and I want to hear more about sort of your definition of police more broadly, because I think, some of us were coming in with this, I think you said constabulary police, right? Like the people that we normally see as police. And that made me think about some things that I learned. If any of you all are Rice undergrads, Dr. Worth's courses, 100% highly recommend if you're interested in these topics around criminal justice and the law. So there's a theorist, his name is Louis Althusser. There's another theorist named Antonio Gramsci, and they both sort of, and then also Foucault, these three theorists, white men as they might be, they had some good points. And they talk about how the nature of the state, as Andrew and Steve and Ashton, we sort of are talking about, the nature of the state is meant to oppress. Like the very goal of the state system is meant to maintain the polity, right? Maintain a certain particular type of community. And one of the things that I think that the role of the police is, and this is something that one of the books that I always talk about anywhere that I go, we have it right here. The Body is Not an Apology by Sonia Renee Taylor. Like this is one of my Bibles, and it's one of the books that I make sure that my students read from, is this idea of what's called a default body, right? And I think this idea of sort of who is a person that is supposed to be a part of the polity, right? And that person is white, that person is cisgender, middle to upper class, that person is cissex, that person is heterosexual, that person is able-bodied both in mind and body. And sort of all of the other parts of oppression, right? And the police are there to maintain that, right? And so there are ways in which by policing, and this happened at Rice University while I was there, and I worked a lot with the then chief of police on some things that happened at Rice, right? You are maintaining who should and should not be on Rice University's campus because a particular type of body belongs there, right? Just like Steve was saying, right? The police are also saying that, okay, these people on these college campuses, they are for the profit of capitalism, right? They're going to income generate, right? They're going to maintain revenue. So it is the job of the police to maintain those people who should be in the policy and then separate those out who are not supposed to be in the policy. And all of that goes back to our bodies and our embodiment of who we are. And a lot of us, that have, gone to places like Rice University or, are in some of these more like protective spaces, and we look like we're not the default body, right? Me as a Black queer woman from a low income family, right? I kind of fit all of the categories of somebody who's not supposed to be there. But because I'm in this protective space, I then get that protective status, right? That I am actually supposed to be a part of the polity in some ways, right? But then if I'm not there in that place, right? If I'm just outside of my house in Durham, North Carolina, there are ways that my body is going to be policed in different ways. And so I think that's really the role of the police, is to sort of help the state navigate who is supposed to be here and who is not, to enact genocide on those who are not supposed to be here. And if they can't enact genocide, right, just like has been done, to the majority of indigenous populations, although they still continue to survive and thrive, right, beyond that genocide, right, there is then a way that you are then taken out of the polity, whether that be through contact with the criminal punishment system, or whether that be low wage jobs where you're not a part of the community, whether that be continual sort of lack of access, like Ashton was talking about earlier, like lack of access to healthcare, lack of access, to all of these things, right? I think the police broadly defined, their goal is to sort of maintain this division and to maintain who is supposed to be the polity and who is not.
I'd say that the police represent everything everybody said is correct. Multiple truths can exist in the same continuum, but I think they represent more than just oppression. I think that they are the embodiment of everything that is wrong with this country. They are the enforcers of policy and law without full knowledge of said policy and law, and they use their powers that are granted to them by the state to protect property, white life, white, W-H-I-T-E, white life. And that's indicative of the January 6th Capitol insurrection, right? These Blue Lives Matter people and All Lives Matter people are real motherfucking quiet right now, excuse my French, because they went and stormed that Capitol and tried to go after legislators. But the reality is that we know from today that it took 3 hours and 18 minutes for the National Guard to show up to the Capitol because they withheld the call for that to happen. Now, when BLM DMV showed up at the Capitol just to protest and exercise their First Amendment rights, you would have thought we were looking at Myanmar. where they were all armed up and, you know, then they hit the kill switch on people's cell phones and devices in front of the White House. They gassed American citizens on US soil, which is a violation of the Constitution. We are expendable. And they are supposed to enforce that expendability. And that's why they need to be abolished.
I think one of I appreciate, these are all really amazing responses, and I'm just going to kind of continue. I have a lot I could say, but I'm just going to kind of continue on the thread that everyone's been weaving. I think one of, we invoked whiteness as property, this very famous law review article by Cheryl Harris. And one of the points that I come to in my research is that one of the properties of whiteness, you know, think about property as an expectation to a benefit, legally trained people here. One of the properties of whiteness is this expectation of police care, that the police very broadly are going to be there for you. I'm a white kid from a predominantly white suburb in New Jersey. This was when I think about my early interactions with constabulary police as a kid who wasn't always the best behaved. We knew that, right? We knew that they would not bust our parties because they were our parties. We were the white kids in New Providence. But we knew that if you were the wrong skin tone and driving through town, you were gonna get, I had a friend who was Guyanese, and he also happened to be relatively wealthy. He had a BMW, and oh boy, he got pulled over a lot. And this was obvious to us. This was just something obvious. I didn't have to get a PhD to know this, but I think that what I found in that writing was this really salient notion, and it was backed up again in my research. You know, in a sort of whiteness's territory like Georgia Tech University, the students really expected the police would be there for them. Even the non-white students, that the police would sort of help maintain the boundary, help make sure that they were diverted from the criminal justice system, not do anything too harsh. And this is kind of miraculous because what happened during my DIS research, don't recall if you knew this in the news, but the Georgia Tech police fatally shot and killed a student. This happened in fall of 2017. A student's name was Scout Schultz. They were a student in a mental health crisis. So it was a situation where the police really, it seemed like this is something that was written for them, right? They're the Georgia Tech police, they care for students, and they failed at it. They failed at it. They shot and killed the student. They pulled out, the student pulled out a small utility knife from a Swiss Army knife, and something about this long, and they were killed. But even after that, and this, I think, what was most interesting to me was that even after that, right, you had a student who was white. They were gender non-binary, but they were white. And even after the student needed care and the police failed to deliver that care, even after they were murdered, the Georgia Tech students, most of them still kind of carried this expectation, you know, they had this property that, property of whiteness, and they carried this expectation that the police were, even after this really spectacular failure of caregiving, were still going to be there for them. It's very powerful. And I think I'll leave it at that, just to kind of complement what other people have said so far.
Thank y'all for your answers. I do see a question that has gotten a lot of upvotes in the Q&A, so I'll read that out. Talking about abolition makes a lot of people uncomfortable. What are main points that you would bring up to people when you want to talk about abolition as a realistic possibility?
One of the points that I would start with, and this is not at the person asking the question, but I got a lot of questions from folks who, from multiple racial identities, and the common denominator from those people who were asking a similar question about, well, how am I going to be safe? Or are we going to be safe? What about my neighborhood? Well, you're coming from a place of privilege, because you know that your money protects you. You know that your whiteness protects you. But the reality is if you look at what you watched the mayor of Houston cut several X amount of dollars from the fire department, which is needed right now during a pandemic to transport people who can't breathe because of the coronavirus, to put more police in predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods because of an increase of crime, which was stemmed from the pandemic because, you know, innovation for my sociology students, people are going to do what they need to do to survive, first and foremost. So if you decrease crime by giving people the means to live, basic stuff like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, home, safe home, food, access to care. And that's what replacing police with is most important about. Now, the real question is what does that look like when we're talking about holding people accountable while abolishing not just policing, but the carceral state? Because if you're going to abolish the police, you have to abolish prisons, state-run and private-run, right? And when people think about that, I'm also talking about undocumented people, kids who are still in detention centers, also known as baby jails. Some of them look like us if you're Black. So, you know, the reality is when we're talking about abolishing policing, we're talking about really dismantling the one thing that keeps this system of things going. And we need to think about it in that context. And when we're talking about dismantling systems, what do we replace them with? And that's a question for you to ponder on yourself. And in terms of, again, answering the main question about what do we do? The reality is we have to get out there and talk to people about what's really actually happening. We can't rely on the news media, even though we have to watch it for the weather and find out what's going on, like when we had the blackout, because it was our only source of information at points. But the reality is we have to look at sources that may be seen as anecdotal, but actually are not. And we have to stop treating people's lived experiences as anecdotal, because the system of things that we live in now is because of that very thing. Treating people's lived experiences as anecdotal, as expendable, or as just some specter out there in the ether. And we can't do that anymore.
I think everything that Ashton said is amazing, and I agree. And what I really want to sort of hone in on uplift is this point about privilege. And I think one of my other Bibles, I don't have it right here next to me, is Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown, and also just linked an abolitionist playlist that one of my good friends shared with me in the chat. And I think there's some really great folks out there who do abolitionist work, particularly around transformative justice. There's a difference between transformative justice and restorative justice. I won't go into that, but transformative justice is what we believe in. We do not believe in restorative justice. And I think really sort of what you have to think about when you're thinking about abolition is, why are you so afraid? And I think like that is what sort of Ashton was saying. And it's really a moment I'll go into sort of my personal ideas that I think that really the one thing you learn in therapy that I advocate, everybody go to therapy, get your life together. I think if everybody went to therapy, we'd be in a much better world. But you got to sit with yourself. Right. And this is one of the things that Sonia Renee Taylor teaches us as well, is what are you so afraid of? Right. What is it that you're afraid of? When we are afraid of abolition, we are afraid of, what if I get hurt? Right? What if somebody hurts somebody else? Right? We're afraid of crime. We're afraid of all of these different things, but only a particular type of crime. Like, you're not afraid that, just like Ashton said, that children are being taken away from their parents at borders. And this is why, like, we can't have, we can't abolish the police and things like that, right? And so it really takes sitting with yourself and saying, what is it that is so serious to me that I cannot allow everybody to live in a free world? What is it that is so serious to me that I cannot see the possibility of reconciliation, right? That I cannot see the possibility that somebody can have a second chance, that I cannot see that somebody's life circumstances, because of the way that the state was created, have set up a situation such that if they are hungry and need food, they might just break into your house to get some food because you have a house and they don't. What is so scary about that, right? And the other thing that I think is really, really important that comes from this sort of this sort of I change me, and by me changing me, I can help change the world sort of perspective, is thinking more clearly about how we think about harm, how we think about shame, how we think about our own instances where we have done harm, and our own inability to come face to face with the fact that we have done harm to others. And because of our inability to come face to face with the fact that we have done harm to others, we cannot accept the fact that others, right, there's a possibility for reconciliation because we never give it to ourselves. And so when we start to give ourselves reconciliation, when we start to forgive ourselves, when we start to come face to face with our own harm, that makes it more possible for us to see other people as human beings who make human mistakes. And abolition is not about saying that everything is going to be perfect and everything is going to be right, but it is really about saying the fact that I can come to my fellow human and say, this is harm. You have done harm to me. How can we reconcile this harm together? How can we work through this together? And then when we can't reconcile that harm together, how do we then come together as a community to talk about what happens in our community to make this harm possible and how we can move forward? I think really sort of this is what I teach, this is sort of my ethos as it stands right now, is really about looking at yourself in the mirror and seeing, and really seeing your relationship with yourself as a then reflection on how you interact with the rest of the world.
All of this. Yeah, all right. Inspired. I have to plug a book too. So We Do This Till We Free Us came out maybe a week and a half ago or so, if that, by Mariam Kaba, which you'll consistently hear as one of these seminal voices in the prison industrial complex abolition movement of the past 30 years or so. Her, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Angela Y. Davis, Black women really doing this work. And everything Ashton and Blaque said. But a particular passage comes out even in the first essay in this collection. And she says this: a world without harm isn't possible and isn't what an abolitionist vision purports to achieve. Rather, abolitionist politics and practice contend that disposing of people by locking them away in jails and prisons does nothing significant to prevent, reduce, or transform harm in the aggregate. And that's it. That's the frame, right? We're not doing away with violence. We're not doing away with harm. We are not naive in the slightest. We recognize that these are parts of the human experience as long as human beings exist. But how do we respond to harm? How do we respond, as Blaque said, to the harm that we perpetrate? How do we respond to the harm that we endure? And then how do we try to build systems of accountability within our communities to ensure that similar forms of harm don't occur in the same manner, and that folks feel like they are built up and supported in a way that allows them to navigate that conflict and still have a community to go to. So that really is it, right? It's not just the absence of these death-making institutions of prisons, police, and surveillance mechanisms, but it's the creation, the presence of, like Ashton said, the healthcare, the food, everything that you need, the art, the beauty, the community that is necessary for our human experience, regardless of where we come from.
So I have, this is where my newness to Houston is going to be a problem, because I had a pretty pat response for this when I was living in Champaign County, Illinois. And this is something that you can talk about with people that are not even people that would never encounter a panel like this in a million years. So I wish there was a way that the audience, but that's not necessary. So, Champaign County, Illinois had 18, this is just talking constabulary police, right? I want to narrow that down. 18 different local police forces in a county of under 200,000 people. Bunch of city ones, and then also the university and also the junior college had its own fully sworn police force. So there was 18 in Champaign County. In Great Britain, there are 40 local police forces, one for every single territory. I forget exactly what they call them in Great Britain, plus Manchester and London, and one weird nuclear one. I don't really know what that does. They look at nuclear power plants. They have nuclear power plant police. Australia has 8, one for each territory. New Zealand just has one local police force. It's like everything. Imagine if the FBI, CIA, and your corner beat cop were all in one organization. Now, I want you to take a guess now how many police forces there are in the United States. Just take a guess. One of the panelists want to write something in the chat, just if they don't know this number off the top of their head already. So let's see one guess just to see where we're at. Okay, 18,000. There's about 18,000 police forces in the United States. There's, I believe, 5,000 in Texas alone. And you think that's it. The idea that towns, these tiny 200-person towns have their own police forces, 1,000-person towns, there's literally not another country on the entire planet that has that. And each one of those are their own, essentially their own free agent. The amount of state oversight of police forces is incredibly lacking, even though they have all the power, right? Police officers in the United States federal system are state peace officers. No other country in the world comes close to this. I'm just thinking in Houston alone, we have the Harris County Constable. I've never heard of a constable system before becoming familiar with Texas. County sheriffs, all the different university police, different hospital, Texas Medical Center, which I live right by, they have their own police force. Each one of these agencies really acts with an incredible, and I would say a little scary amount of autonomy. And I think that one of the interesting points about abolition that I make, or just any sort of broad reform, is that people focus a lot on the police agencies that's right in front of them, but they really need to be turning their attention to the state capitol. The state capitol can do a lot. Some kind of fantastic pie in the sky idea that I've had is think about what Scott Walker did in Wisconsin. Which was eliminate all public sector bargaining except for matter of wages. Now imagine if something like that were to happen to the police force. Suddenly, a lot of barriers to good oversight would disappear if there was a Scott Walkerization of the police, that they couldn't bargain to have in their contract all of these independent arbitrators. So I'll just plant that idea there before moving on from that 18,000 number. No one else comes close. No one else comes close. Brazil is number 2 at like 3,000. We're the only country in the world like this.
Okay, thank you guys for your answers. So I've noticed in the chat, Ashton, you said that you want to answer this one question, if you're okay with answering it now. The question is, not all crime is because of poverty or mental illness. I'm gay. What about racial, religious, or sexual persecution? What about the church and school tax? How do we protect ourselves if there is no deterrent out there that these haters don't consider?
So the reality is I'm speaking as an openly Black, gay atheist who is living with HIV. I came out at the age of 14, 15 years old and started the first gay straight alliance in the city of New Orleans and in high school as a freshman. And when my family put me out on the street by the time I was 15, when I dealt with police, I was accused of sex work, which should be legalized as a caveat, but I was accused of sex work and harassed instead of giving somewhere warm to sleep or somewhere dry where I can lay my head and food to put on my stomach. So from an early age, I never trusted the police. And in reality, when we're talking about protecting LGBTQ people, most likely it's specifically trans people, not just cis gay people. The reality is this: the police actually misgender trans people, they abuse trans people, they abuse our LGBT homeless youth that actually hang out around Montrose and Westheimer. If you're not familiar with the area, and you go and ask them how they feel about the police. The reality is that we do need something to replace police. And I mentioned that earlier, but that has to be a collective thought and something that everybody has to sit down and ponder for themselves before we can come together as one unit and community to actually figure out what that looks like. One person cannot make that decision, and it should always be monitored and have oversight that is actually real and with teeth. And so when we're talking about protecting churches while holding them accountable for religious persecution, I would submit to you, like I did when I first came to Texas, is go to the Texas Capitol and talk to the legislators and work with the legislators. I've had success along with other activists working in groups to get it easier for something as simple as getting gender marker changes on your ID when you transition. And so when we talk to the people who have been elected to lead us and give them our perspectives on things that they're doing that are harmful, we are more likely to get things changed. The reality is changing law doesn't always protect everyone because we're still living in a state that is built on the foundations of racism and capitalism, which stems from slavery itself. They were the first commodity on the stock exchange. Your AIG insurance company was the first insurer of slaves. And they underwrite a lot of insurance companies that you might even use for your car, if you have one. The reality is when you peel back that onion, let me go back for a second. I want to make sure I answer everything. When we're talking about racial, religious, and sexual orientation persecution, the persecution starts with the elected official. Their words and their actions, whether they contradict each other or not, when they sign off on changes. For example, your current mayor, Sylvester Turner, ran on the idea of passing the Houston Equal Rights Ordinance, which still has not come up, for protecting LGBT people and all Houstonians. This is one of the largest cities in the country that does not have a non-discrimination ordinance that can be enforced. So you don't have any protections as a Houstonian or as a Texan. And when we're talking about police, and we're also talking about respectability politics, not just people who put on a badge and wear a gun and a bulletproof vest. The policing starts with the people who empower the police. If you take the police power away, you do it through legislation. You do it through city ordinance. You do it through county referendum. You do it through the commissioner's court. And the reality is, protecting ourselves, what does that look like? That looks like what you decided to be. Some of us have taken self-defense. Some of us have done different things. But the only thing that I've ever felt like I've needed protection from was white LGBTQ people, police, and white people in general. Because the relationship to police abolition and racism and my Black body looks like this. Because people adopt the ideologies of what police departments teach. You walk down the street, you got all these Karens walking up on people in parks talking about, you can't be here, you're barbecuing, you're in my space. Well, colonizer, you're taking up a lot of space. You're taking up space in a country that's on stolen land. And I'm a descendant of stolen bodies. And so I feel as though as a gay person, as a Black person, as someone who is living with HIV from a healthcare aspect, we must educate people about the different corners of life. So instead of treating people as deviants in the society, we would be better off when we all know about each other and recognize our differences and live in some type of cohabitation. And the reality is that some people gotta go. That's what really getting rid of police is like when we're talking about how the state of Texas made it illegal for cities to mandate that police officers be local. Well, if you got Karen, who is in Teach for America, teaching in the classroom, who don't give a shit about Tommy, Derek, and Lakeisha, who live down the street and have racist ideologies and show up to Trump insurrections and come back to school without a mask on to teach our children, while there's a cop in the hallway who ain't from the city of Houston, who will slam a child on the ground for them to be pushed into alternative school systems and have their record permanently fucked up before they can even make it to their sophomore year. Yeah, there's a lot to worry about.
So I just want to say amen, hallelujah. Thank you, Ashton, hallelujah. And just to sort of add on to that question, and I looked through some of the other questions that folks have. I think I want to challenge you all out there to see from a different perspective. I think what we as panelists are trying to do is trying to shift the perspective that you see. And so I'm going to share something on my screen that I know has been really imperative to changing my own perspective. And this is a quote by Assata Shakur, mother of the movement. And I think, this is really important. Let me make sure, I hope everybody can see what I'm about to read. So it is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. And the reason why I bring that up is because it speaks so much to what Ashton is saying, because the true problem in police abolition, the true problem in oppression in the United States of America is the fact that we do not accept each other as humans for who we really are. So when we talk about like how, you know, and I understand, right, as an openly queer person myself, as a person who comes from a low income background, although I'm moving up the class ladder now and getting like a PhD, but as a Black woman in this world, I completely understand I've been the victim of so much harm and violence. And at the end of the day, what I know to be true is that because we do not look at our fellow human and love them as a fellow human, or even though, not in spite of, but because of all of their differences from us, that is where the problem fundamentally lies. The fundamental foundation of the United States of America is on difference and oppression of human bodies. The reason why we are afraid of white supremacists, the reasons why we have to be afraid of LGBTQ people, of people in the church who are not accepting, the reason why we think about, well, what am I going to do as a person who is oppressed, right? Because they're going to come at me. The reason is we all need to sit down and love each other as human beings. And that's not to say that tomorrow we're going to be like, okay, everybody love each other, like the system is done, like it's over, right? There is, you know, just as Miriam Cobham talks about, there's steps, right? There's an interim step to it, right? But the fundamental thing I think we're challenging everybody to see is like, don't just look at what's happening on the top here and be like, well, I'm afraid of these people and I'm afraid of these people and I'm afraid of these people. Look at the reason why you have to have fear, which is at the bottom of it all. It's the systems of oppression that make it so that because of who I am looked at differently and treated differently in society. And even for me, I have had to unlearn and decolonize for myself, internalize homophobia, looking at, you know, thinking about you know, undocumented people, right? And sort of recalibrating my idea about borders and how ridiculously stupid the concept of borders even are, right? I've had to rethink, right? All of these ideas, right? And that goes back to some of my point about thinking about where you cause harm. The fundamental problem in our society is the fact that we do not see each other as humans. And I think once you get to that understanding, it takes you in a completely different path. Instead of being like, well, who is going to protect me? To instead say, I know my community is going to protect me. And until we can come together as a community, there is no future for us, right? We can go to the state legislature. I think that's an interim step, right? That Ashton is talking about. What can we do right now? And I think Ashton's work is like really good for saying, what can we do right now at this moment? Go to your state legislature, go to these people. But at the end of the day, right? And this is the problem. If we don't all come together, if we don't all get therapy and come together and realize that we are all humans, we go nowhere, right? We will all fall together regardless of anything. And like, that's the sad part of sort of our history in the United States with one another. But I really want to push everybody in this like panel series to really think more critically about what's underlying your fear, what is underlying the way that you interact with people in the everyday world, and how changing your thought process to thinking more specifically about the reasons why we are here today, which is systems of oppression that are based on differences, based on bodies, leads us to this place. And you're not going to change the mind of somebody who thinks differently than you. So then what I do is, and I know Ashton does this too, focus on your sphere of influence. Do not worry about the white supremacists that are over there, because they're going to be white supremacists and they're going to keep doing white supremacist shit until they die. You know what I'm saying? But at the end of the day, what can you do? How can you learn to love yourself better and treat your friend better and think about other people differently and not cause harm, and hope that maybe one day you're not causing harm will create a chain reaction that other people don't cause harm. But I think that that mind shift is really important in thinking towards abolition. And it's a hard thing to do, I think, and my argument is, until you come face to face with who you are and your role in this world.
May I just briefly add, the United States is the greatest exporter of violence that the world has ever seen. This 245-year-old nation, with its military that's the largest polluter in the world, with its imperialism that is leading us to ecological collapse, to its cages that keep nearly 2.3 million people kept away from their families or under control of the state. That is violence, right? And so we can talk about interpersonal violence, and we can talk about the fears of harm that we have to our individual persons. But to think about this land that has been colonized by this nation and how violent it is, right? And that's a question I think that's often posed to abolitionists. What about the rapists? What about the murderers? American prisons are the rapists, are the murderers. the levels of sexual violence and homicide occurring in these institutional settings is unbelievable. And it's just the reports we're getting. The Department of Justice might put out its report and say X number of murders happened. But you look at Parchman Penitentiary in Mississippi, you probably had, 2 people per month dying in Parchman or greater, right, over a 6-month stretch. So, we have to think about this, right? These are questions to have and to grapple with, right? But just as all the panelists have said, you've got to really think about how violent these institutions are and how they will never deliver justice, despite the harm that you may have suffered, from another person.
I've been going last in all this, and it just leaves me this unlucky choice of having so much to go off of and so much to go on, but a limited time to talk that I want to intentionally limit to. So I'm just going to kind of go on to one point from this initial question, which is this: who is going to protect me? And I think one important piece of context, current context that we haven't talked about yet is COVID-19. When this first, when this first happened, when the pandemic first became something suddenly we became legitimately scared about, the state's response, the federal government's response, I want to issue the federal government's, was horrifyingly bad. I referred to, I call it the Reagan Revolution metastasizing, right? You go 45 years of destroying and cutting back on the government institutions that are supposed to respond to this. Centers for Disease Control, National Institutes of Health, this entire way the state could mobilize for an emergency. When you spend 40 years gutting them, and the real emergency arises, we can't deal with it. We refuse, we not only can't, but we refuse to, at least the federal government refused to. Certain states tried with limited resources to do something. And so I'd like to imagine a world where the state actually took care of us, right? Everyone, not because it takes care of people like me relatively well. But even then, and I think this is at the root of those bonkers protests you saw in places like Michigan demanding that the state be reopened, was that even then people, exurban white people from the suburbs of Grand Rapids and the exurbs of Detroit, even they were feeling like the state was failing them, which is something that Black and brown people in the United States know very well. But when they were experiencing it, they freaked out. People stormed the Capitol. People stormed the Capitol in Michigan. It was a dress rehearsal for what we saw last month or 2 months ago. And so I think just what I'm trying to get at here is just think about abolition also needs to consider recalibrating the state to actually make sure people don't die. And that's police are obviously a huge part of that. And I'm just going to kind of end it there, let the other panelists get their words in too.
Thank y'all. It seems that we have a few questions kind of asking broadly about what kind of things we imagine taking place if we were to abolish police. I see a question asking about the feasibility of having social workers and mental health professionals replace police, and what steps would it take to get to that kind of point. I also see a question about how do we ensure that these newly funded institutions do not end up as racist and problematic as our current system. So if y'all wouldn't mind just kind of sharing your thoughts on what the future could look like without police.
So there are a couple of things within the school setting, and shout out to New Orleans with Ashton. There is a dope base building organizing group called the Rethinkers that is primarily fighting privatization in New Orleans post-Katrina, but also fighting the school to prison pipeline. And a young person that they organized with, George Carter, died when he was 15 years old. And one thing that George would say while he was living was that he don't want meal detectors when he comes to school. He wants mood detectors, right? He wants a garden that he can come to in his school, somewhere where he feels like he can thrive and he can flourish within his community of peers in his school. And so I think that is what it could look like within the context of school, right? And we have to be very vigilant about those mental health professionals having the political education to not be anti-Black, quite frankly, and continually perpetuate these systems, these carceral logics that are hurting so many of our Black and brown babies right now. So there's that within the school context. In terms of community, I'm interested in programs that talk about social workers taking the place of police officers, those with trained mental health professional backgrounds to come and assist in the crises that might come up in community. But I also think about violence interruption programs. I remember being in college and doing a spring break in Baltimore, and this program called Safe Streets, doing a canvassing hour, usually every Wednesday in the community, kind of walking around this neighborhood in Baltimore, chanting, asking what folks needed, just kind of being out and about, right? I think that it goes to a recurring theme that we have reflected on in the past 75 minutes. That is, the community will protect and take care of itself, right? And to especially have elders, right? I don't know if they will be, formal positions that folks will hold to think of violence interruption or, a coordinator within the community, but even having an elder to just come and, you see that a conflict is building up. This is an opportunity to say, oh, like, let's reconsider, let's think about, escalating this further. We don't have to do that. So, I think there are various ways that folks have done this already, right, without, explicitly calling it abolitionist, and just leaning into that more, how we have survived, over the course of this nation's history, right, particularly as Black people, and just building more and more of that, mutual aid, as Ashton said, and community care, as other folks have reflected on.
So I think the role of mental health and social service professionals, one important thing, this dovetails with what I just said. When someone's in a mental health crisis and the police or some kind of first responder is necessary, there are so many steps leading up to that where someone, and I think the state, could have intervened, right? There used to be more robust state mental health institutions, which I'm not going to try to say that they were great places, but what if we invested in them so that someone is not on the street in a crisis requiring some kind of first responder who has a gun on their hip? What if there was more, and this is the point that I really hammer home as someone in Kinder Institute who researches housing, but what if we had better assistive housing? What if we had affordable housing? But so many health benefits and life benefits are tied just to having a safe and stable and secure roof over your head and running water and electricity, so many things. So I think that's one thing, is think about, yes, the responders are important, but diverting money and funds and investments to these other things can prevent the emergency from even arising in the first place. So don't just be reactive, be proactive. And I think the second part of that is actually a story that I want to tell. So my wife's from St. Paul, Minnesota. I've spent a lot of time in the Twin Cities. I was married there a year and a half ago. And George Floyd was murdered 4 blocks from where a close friend of mine lives. And the police station they burned down was right next to my wife's old employer. I know Minneapolis very well. It's sort of a home to me. And so when I was visiting my in-laws, I called my friend Grant. This guy's in the neighborhood of George Floyd's murder site. And he says he's been really involved in this community patrol. And I go to follow around. I talk with him a lot about it. And he's got a 9-to-5. He owns a house, and he is out 30 hours a week on top of his job doing things like responding to mental health issues. They don't deal with violence intervention. They don't deal if there's gun, but it's like people who, mostly people without secure homes in the midst of crises, or oftentimes domestic issues as well, and they try to intervene. They're training themselves. It's this BIPOC-led coalition. They were on a Vice documentary recently. I don't have a link to it, but I might put it in the chat. And I hear this. He's working 50 hours a week for his job already. He's doing an extra 30 with this patrol group. And I ask him, and I'm like, it's coming up on winter in Minnesota, which is violent, and not, the weather's violent. It's not actually, it's very non-violent by a lot of standards. But I asked him, like, is this sustainable? Like, this is, and he's kind of honest with me, like, no, like and so, you know, you think about these community, like you can have a community-led group, but you have, like, there's necessary to build permanent institutions with funding and support that can prevent the crisis from even happening in the first place. We think about violence intervention and police's role there, but we want it so that the violence does not even need to be intervened on. You need to kind of expect things of our public institutions to deliver the care and the help that we broadly, and I'm not just we meaning people who look like me, but broadly to help our lives flourish. End it there.
I mean, I guess my angle is the first thing that you want to think about is the people. Are you someone who has a loved one that has a mental health or a developmental condition? My uncle is schizophrenic, and he came to Houston after Katrina, and it wasn't safe, so we had to send him to Massachusetts. And I think about all of the people who have had to deal with mental health, disabilities, thinking about people who drive modified vehicles, who have to type in their devices in order to respond to someone verbally. I'm thinking about all of those things, or even a pregnant woman in Washington State who got murdered after she called the police for someone breaking into her house. We have to talk about the idea of social workers and therapists actually showing up instead of police when a mental health call is sent through 911 or a non-emergency line, because police officers are aggressive. And when you think about earlier that, well, actually last summer before George Floyd was murdered, there were about 7 people who were murdered right here in Houston by multiple law enforcement agencies that still have not gotten justice, and their families are still seeking justice. A couple of them were dealing with mental health issues. And when the mayor put together his police advisory board or commission to come up with ideas that would help to create a better environment in the city of Houston, beyond the demands that Black Lives Matter Houston, which I'm part of, ACLU of Texas, and a host of other organizations put together a packet. And the reality is we made that same demand, except the policing commission said, well, a police officer show up with these 2 people who deal with medical care. But I believe that in essence, we're contradicting something. A lot of people who I know that deal with anxiety, adjustment disorders, things like that, they are actually triggered into crisis by the sight of a police officer. And the reality to that is we have to look at people in their unique situations. I know we are all one person with one brain, but collectively, we have to look at situations. Literally, as I stated much earlier in this conversation, we must stop treating people's lived experiences as anecdotal. And we have to make sure that we are actively listening to people and actively making responses that actually help that person get to a place where they feel mentally safe. Not creating a safe space, because that's a term that I don't like to use too much, but the idea of safety in and of itself does not have to involve law enforcement. It does not have to involve incarceration. Because if you look at Harris County Jail, which, whether people realize it or not, it is the largest mental health institution in Harris County. Okay. And when you break that down in a situation like COVID-19, where there are people who were out protesting, by my count of over 2,000, who it took us days after the first arrest started to get lists We work with multiple elected officials who called to try to help us get lists of people who were in jail so we can do bail response and things like that. People are coming out with broken fingers and broken toes. We're made to sit in facilities stacked on each other without masks on or proper social distancing. And also when you think about how it's a mental health care situation, that adds to that the idea that we have a cite and release program that's hardly been used through COVID-19 and even before. And there have been more arrests during COVID-19 between today and the George Floyd protests than in the last 2 years, with people sitting in jail for victimless crimes, being put at risk for COVID-19. And you think about how that affects a person who might be in mental health crisis, sitting in isolation, possibly being taunted by the guards, and dealing with the specter of catching a life-threatening virus. And I'll leave it there.
I think I'll just add on to what everyone else has said. There's an important quote by Toni Morrison. I think I might get it a little bit wrong, but she talks about how the work of, I believe she says, the work of capitalism is to distract us, right? And so I think that, somebody pointed this out too in the questions, and sort of thinking about what does the future look like, thinking about mental health and things like that. One of the things that I really think about sort of in my future career is, what does it look like for us to really use churches as churches? And by that, I mean, what if your church was your local mental health institution? It wasn't about religion. It wasn't about God and sins and saving you and communion every Sunday, but if it was actually about coming to a place and getting fed, coming to a place and getting healing and wholeness in the way of, how do we communicate lovingly with one another? How do we do conflict resolution? Why are we sitting around here with churches whose doors are closed Monday through Saturday when there are people that do not have homes out on the street? Why are people not sleeping there, right? Why are people not being fed there, right? And a lot of this is the fundamental work of capitalism. And I'll go back to it, just like I've been saying before, these systems of oppression that have set us up this way. So in reality, I think, yes, it's great for, social workers and mental health workers to, be on the front lines. But what does it look like for somebody to look at their fellow neighbor and be like, oh my goodness, are you okay? Do you want to sit with me for a while? But the reason why we don't have time to sit a while, because I got to go to work in the morning. I got to pay for daycare. I got to pay for my car note. I got to do X, Y, and Z, right? And that is sort of, the more radical view. And I get to think like that because I do have a house and I do have a car and, I don't have any children, right? And I do have stable income. And so there are ways, again, like I talked about, to sort of mediate this, to have a middle point where we do get social workers, properly trained social workers, though. And this is a problem with sort of always relying on the state, is that the state is fundamentally all of the isms. I'm not going to run through them 50 times, but it's fundamentally all of the isms, right? So if we really want to involve the state, we need to set a fire to the state, and then we need to start all over again, right? And then we need to start all over again by thinking with logics that value human to human and not all of these other things that we have made differences on. But I think that's a good, that is one of the ways, for people that are thinking about, okay, well, what can I do right now? Right now, you can go to your local church and ask your local church to actually be a church. And to actually be kind to people, to actually have a place for people to stay, because a home, water, and food are 3 basic needs of people, right? And everybody should have it. Everybody should have a right to it. I shouldn't have to pay rent to have a roof over my head, right? That is quite ridiculous, right? And it's something that relates to this concept called the privatization of citizenship. And it's the result of neoliberalism that goes back to Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, the 2 people that literally destroyed the world. Like, they are responsible for the shitstorm that we are now in, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, because they developed this concept of neoliberalism, this idea of trickle-down economics, that if we make enough money at the top, everybody else will soon get it. And we were already fucked before that, but they created even more fuckery that we are in right now, right? And so that comes from the state. That was a president and a prime minister did that shit, and they tore the entire global world with that rhetoric, right? And so in effect, in order, if we're going to change anything to get to sort of these radical things that we've all been talking about today, you kind of got to burn it down and start all over. We need a French Revolution style, eat the rich kind of thing. And that's the way we're going to move forward. But in the meantime, why don't you take a second and realize that capitalism is what makes you unable to help your fellow human being and turn around and maybe help your fellow human being. Instead of walking past people on the street and ignoring them, why don't you talk to them, right? Ask them how they're doing, right? Hand them a couple of dollars if you have something. Go and buy a meal, right? Be kind. Literally just be kind. I'm not saying that as some sort of like hippy dippy, like if we all be kind, like it'll be a better world. But in actuality, like if we all be kind, it would be a better world. And I think the other thing I'll sort of end on is sort of rethinking notions of safety. I think this is something that Ashton sort of just talked about, is this idea of safety, but his definition of safety was very different than the safety I think people have been sort of questioning earlier, right? What is the true definition of safety? What does safety actually look like? And I would encourage everybody to read Octavia Butler, because I think that the work that Octavia Butler does as a Black queer sci-fi scholar is to help us imagine a world that is different from the world we currently live in, the way we currently treat humans. And her work has really inspired my thinking on how we live as a community and what we owe each other as a community and society, and the ways in which we will eventually come to our own demise. She does a lot of sort of post-apocalyptic sort of work. I mean, the lady predicted Donald Trump. Black queer women, like, we just be knowing things. And so I totally recommend that sort of reading, but it's a lot of reading and thinking. You got to do a lot of reading and thinking, and sitting down with yourself, and not let capitalism continue to sort of distract you, right, from progress and where we go, and sort of thinking about a radical future.
Okay, thank you guys so much for your answers, and just for the panel so far. The discussion has been amazing. And I think I want to end on this note, and I think Blaque talked about this a little bit, but where do we go from here? And do you guys have any advice for people on the panel to navigate the current system that we're in that hasn't quite caught up to, you know, the abolitionist about imagination yet?
So we've seen multiple crises converge over the past year in the name of the coronavirus pandemic, in the name of police violence is taking Black people daily, right? Ashton makes that point that there's so many unnamed folks who have died at the hands of the police and prisons, and that neoliberalism and capitalism and how these systems, as Blaque said, have ruined the world continuously for decades and centuries. So folks have gotten more radicalized by the day, right? Recognizing that the government's not going to do anything, right? To Steve's point, you know, it'd be nice to have this compassionate state that actually cares about the people within its borders if borders have to be there. But the United States clearly does not. But in this moment, also in recognizing the crises, so much potential is ripe. We saw after George Floyd, starting with Minneapolis public schools, a vote to end its contract with the Minneapolis Police Department. Similar action from the University of Minnesota, talking about campus police. All the way to Oakland, where the Oakland Unified School District voted to entirely disband its internal school police department, and is in the phases of implementation of that. Even up to just a few weeks ago, where the Los Angeles Unified School District voted to divert a multi-million-dollar budget away from its school police department to these academic and social support services for young people. So we are living in a moment of great chaos and suffering. You know, everybody has experienced the past year, but we are also living in a place of incredible potential. Just to think about this book, it's number 10 on the paperback nonfiction New York Times bestseller list. Mariame Kaba wrote an op-ed in the New York Times in June saying, yes, we literally mean abolish the police. I think this momentum is something that folks knew was going to come eventually, but did not quite anticipate the pace as these crises have continued to play out. So, you know, continue to radically imagine what the world can be as we build toward that French Revolution of the 21st century, but, you know, consistently, as Blaque said, struggle, read, be in community with folks, grapple with the ideas, keep the conversation going. It's necessary to build that better, more just world.
I would leave you with the idea of challenging the idea of seeking power versus empowering people, number one. And number two, what to think about this looks like, this world, this country would look like reimagined in a way that abolishes the current system of things. Because when we talk about context, internationalist lens, Black Lives Matter is not just a United States thing. There are Black and brown bodies all over the world who are dealing with the same things that we're dealing with. Are you paying attention? Myanmar, China, Nigeria, Eritrea, different places on every continent. And the reality of what I'm bringing up is this. We deal with specific threats every day, locally and internationally. Think about what you want your country to look like and what you want your home and space to look like while protecting your people. It doesn't look like militarization, but also says that, oh, if one day this system collapses and we want to keep it going, how do we keep the hospitals going? How do we keep the lines of communication open? How do we keep education to continue? And what that looks like, what frameworks do we want to use? Those are the realities that we must contend with depending on the level of abolition we speak on. What are the consequences? Do the SWOT analysis. What are the consequences, good or bad, that come from the changes that we need to make and what we need to be demanding from people? And when I talked about power versus empowerment, there are people who all they seek is visibility and power. And when they talk about being warriors and revolutionaries and all of these different things, while they walk around with their Jordans on and driving their Benz, I'm not hating on nobody. But the reality that I grew up in is my uncle had a nice car. He left it at home and took his old Silverado to work so the white people wouldn't see it and try to take his job. So the reality that we're living in right now, that still exists. But the other reality, or the other part of that reality that I'm speaking on, is imagine what it looks like. Think about what that looks like and how to implement it and how to make sure that when the French Revolution happens, that people's heart monitors and machines and surgeries won't get disrupted, like, you know, the winter storm a couple weeks ago where hospitals were running out of electricity and generation and then eventually lost clean water. Let's think about this. We are living in a city that has 13 Superfund sites. That's environmentally declared areas that are not safe for people to live in, while kids go to school across the street from concrete facilities with police officers on campus and breathing in dirty air. What does that look like? How do we challenge the environmental racism? How do we challenge all of these things and make sure that we're not falling into the grasp of capitalism, which in context, we're already by no fault of our own capitalists, but how to work out not falling into I'm a vegan, I'm a vegetarian, and I'm still wearing leather type thing. I mean, like actually renewable materials for our clothes, actual renewable materials to build our homes, solar power, those types of things. How do we empower ourselves to not depend on government and therefore not empower government?
I'll just say you have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And this is something that I struggle with, like even to this day. And it's something that, again, is about sort of looking yourself in the face and like being okay with like, here's where I am. Like, I want to be like, since I was at Rice, like I was ready for the revolution. I used to tell my friends, like, look, when the revolution comes, I'm gonna be calling y'all, I'm gonna be at the front lines. I'm gonna call y'all, but I'm gonna be there. And I'm gonna like throw the first Molotov cocktail, right? I mean, in reality, I'm sitting here in a PhD program, about to get my PhD in a couple years, and then I'm gonna go be a professor. And like my life is gonna continue to look like, right, the sort of regular life that one person can have. And I think, you know, it takes a step to truly be the change that you want to see. And I think Ashton embodies this really well. I only say that just because I know Ashton's work from the time that I was in Houston, but to really give of yourself fully, to forego your comforts in your life in order to be there for your community. And I have my own personal reasons for not foregoing a whole bunch of comforts and wanting to be comfortable, because I grew up poor and I was like, look, I don't want to be poor no more. And I, you know, and that is sort of an embodiment of sort of the capitalist logic within me in terms of like wanting to be comfortable. But I think, you know, what can you do in your day? Like, it's hard. Like, this is what I teach my students. Like, you're not going to change the world in your lifetime. It is not going to happen. And this is what Adrienne Marie Brown tells us as well, is that it comes in little seeds. We drop a seed and the seed germinates and it grows, and then somebody else comes and waters it, and somebody else comes and picks it, and things like that. But I also think it's time for us to get comfortable being uncomfortable. If we all stopped working, do you know how serious life would be if we all were just like, fuck capitalism, I'm not going to work today. You know, now we have to be mindful, like Ashton said, you know, the hospitals and the such and such, right? So we need to be more coordinated in how we all stop going to work. But do you know how the NASDAQ and the Wall Street would just fall apart? Like if we just stop working, like I think about that all the time. Like, what if people like who actually fundamentally manage the capitalist system just like stopped working, right? Like, what if we all came together to do that? But you know the reason why we don't? Racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, all of that stuff that keeps us divided. And that's why I'll go back to decolonizing your own mind, working to see your fellow human as a human, and working in that sphere of influence, because that's you know, one step at a time, and that's how we get there.
I saw that we're over time, so I'm going to be very brief. I think we brought up the storm last week, and I think this can tie into everything we've said about policing at this panel. We often think about these actions as policy failures, as training failures, as state failures, but you have to start thinking about them as features, not bugs. You have to, I really hate the language of policy failure or state failure. Even the person who designed the electrical utility system said that it was acting the way it was supposed to when people received tens of thousands of dollars in their electrical bill. So I'm going to kind of end it at that. I have my contacts in the chat, and I also just want to say thank you to the organizers and to the other panelists. This has been a really wonderful introduction to the broader community. Thank you.
Great. So I think with that, we're going to end the panel this evening. Thank you all so very much. This was better than I could have ever expected. We really appreciate y'all.
Definitely want to echo what Malika said. Thank you guys so much for coming, especially our panelists and our attendees who showed up, asked really productive questions in the chat. Thank you guys so much for making this event fantastic.
Thank you for inviting.
Thank you so much. Hi, parents.
wonderful.
See you there.
Thank you for having me, guys.